When we decided to move to St. Augustine, the oldest city in the United States, we just wanted a fresh start. We found a charming old house at an unbelievable price. It seemed perfect, large, full of history, and completely quiet. The real estate agent told us that the house had been empty for years. "No one has stayed here for long," he said, laughing nervously. I didn't care. I liked the quiet, and after years of hustle and bustle in the big city, it felt like a refuge. The first few days were peaceful. The old walls, covered in worn wallpaper, seemed to embrace us with a nostalgic feeling. The wood creaked slightly under our footsteps, but other than that, the silence was total. No outside sounds, no night noises. It was as if the house were isolated from the world. The first night, I noticed something strange. When I went to close the windows, I noticed that the air was still. No wind was blowing outside, not the slightest rustle of the trees. The city seemed to have frozen. "Did you hear that?" I asked my wife later. "Heard what?" she replied, frowning. "Exactly, nothing, not even the sound of the wind." We laughed, trying to ignore it, but the silence began to weigh on us, as if it had a presence of its own, watching our every move. On the third night, I woke up in the middle of the night. The silence seemed deeper, denser. I got up to get a glass of water, and as I walked through the living room, I noticed something strange. All the chairs were facing the wall. I stood there, staring at it for a few seconds. I didn't remember doing that. The next day, I asked my wife if she had moved the chairs. She looked at me with a confused expression. "No." "Why?" I decided to ignore it. Maybe I was just tired and had moved the chairs without realizing it. But that night, the silence was broken. It started as a distant murmur, like a whispered conversation between two people. It seemed to come from the walls, slowly growing louder until it filled the room. I stood up again, this time with my heart racing. I walked into the hallway and looked around. No one. That was when I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. I tried to turn on the light, but the switch wouldn't work. The sound of the footsteps stopped right at the top of the stairs, and a chill filled the house, chilling the air. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed in the darkness, and for a second, everything was silent again. Then a soft, drawling voice whispered, very close to my ear, "You shouldn't have come." My body froze. The whisper still echoed in my mind, soft and cold, like an icy breath. "You shouldn't have come." My breathing became heavy. The footsteps started again, closer now, slowly descending the stairs. Each step seemed louder than the last, breaking the oppressive silence that dominated the house. The hallway was dark, and no matter how hard I tried to see, there was nothing but darkness. It was then that the lights flickered for a second, illuminating enough for me to see a silhouette standing at the top of the stairs, tall, thin, with her head tilted to the side. I didn't move. My heart was hammering in my chest, and the air around me seemed thicker and thicker. "You shouldn't be here," the voice sounded again, this time coming from inside the wall. My reaction was instinctive. I ran through the living room, tripping over the chairs still facing the wall, and threw myself against the front door, trying to open it. Locked. The key was in place, but it wouldn't turn. That was when I heard the most disturbing sound yet. Laughter. It was soft, almost childlike, but filled with something that wasn't human. It came from the hallway, and the sound grew closer and closer. The house seemed alive, as if the environment itself wanted to keep me inside. I looked back and saw that all the doors were open, wide open, revealing dark rooms that had previously been closed. At the back of each one, shadows danced, forming figures that seemed to watch me, motionless and hungry. The silence returned suddenly, but this time it was even heavier, as if it were swallowing me. My ears rang, and the air turned cold. The door behind me slowly opened with a long, deep creak. I stood still, unable to move. I felt an icy hand touch my shoulder. "Look at me," the voice whispered. I closed my eyes, my entire body shaking. I knew I couldn't look. If I did, I would never leave that house again. I gathered all the courage I had left and ran outside, without looking back. The night air enveloped me, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I crossed the garden, certain that something was at the door, watching me with its gaze. When I reached the sidewalk, I looked at the house once more. The door was closed again. The windows were dark, but on the second floor, I saw a pale face watching me. It smiled before disappearing into the shadows. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in my house seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to hide something. The silence was never the same again. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear distant murmurs, followed by footsteps that stop at my bedroom door. And every time this happens, a voice whispers softly, as if waiting for me. Look at me, just one more time. I have always been passionate about art, so when I was offered the opportunity to take care of an old mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, during a period of restoration, I accepted without hesitation. The mansion was huge, with winding hallways, high ceilings, and dozens of old paintings on the walls, depicting figures from bygone eras. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was slowly setting, painting the house with an orange glow. The hallways were quiet, and the sound of my footsteps echoed faintly. I was given a room on the second floor, next to a gallery filled with portraits of the mansion's former owners. The paintings were impressive, almost mesmerizing. The eyes of the subjects seemed to follow me, but I thought it was just the realism of the brushstrokes. The first night, the silence was absolute. There was no sound of wind or distant cars, just the soft ticking of an antique clock in the living room. I fell asleep, peacefully. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up with a strange feeling, as if someone was watching me. I sat up in bed, trying to figure out what was bothering me. The room was dark, except for a faint light coming from the hallway. When I looked toward the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The closest painting was facing me. In the hallway, where it had previously hung facing the opposite wall, the painting was now facing me directly. The portrait showed a woman in a black dress with empty eyes, her face tilted slightly to the side, as if she were curious. I tried to convince myself that someone must have moved the painting, but who would do that in the middle of the night? I got up slowly, my heart racing. As I got closer, I noticed something even stranger. The woman's face seemed to have changed slightly since the last time I had seen the painting. At that moment, a cold breeze passed through the hallway, and the lights flickered. The painting trembled slightly, as if it were alive, and then, I swear I saw the woman blink. My feet were rooted to the ground, unable to move. The painting now showed the woman with a faint smile, her eyes fixed on me, as if she was pleased to have my attention. Before I could react, I heard a soft whisper, coming from somewhere inside the wall. "You can be a part of it too." I wanted to run, but my feet were stuck to the ground, as if something invisible was holding me back. The painting in front of me seemed more and more real. The woman's smile had grown, and her eyes, previously just painted, shone in the dim light of the hallway. "You can be a part of it too," the voice repeated, soft and mesmerizing, like an invitation impossible to refuse. I gathered what little courage I had left and took a step back. The painting shook again, and a crack appeared in the glass that protected it. Before I could think, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, dragging, heavy. I turned around quickly, but the hallway was empty. Only, something had changed. All the other paintings were also turned towards me. There were dozens of them, each one depicting a different figure. Men, women, and children, all with eyes that followed my every move. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I ran down the hallway, dodging the shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. I passed several paintings that, at a glance, showed different faces than the ones I had seen before, as if each one of them was transforming. Finally, I reached the gallery door and pushed it open hard, stepping out into the main room. The house was plunged into silence again, but now the air was thick and cold. I glanced at the antique clock on the wall. The hands had stopped at 3 in the morning, the same time it had all started. It was then that I noticed something disturbing. My reflection in the glass of the door was different. In the reflection, my face looked distorted. My smile was too wide, and my eyes were empty, like those of the figures in the paintings. I took a step back, but the reflection remained motionless, still staring at me, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if studying my reaction. Suddenly, an icy hand touched my shoulder. I turned quickly, but there was no one there, only the echo of a low laugh, which seemed to come from within the walls. My eyes returned to the reflection, and this time, the reflection blinked. "You already belong to us," the voice whispered once more, and then everything went dark. The next morning, I woke up on the living room floor, my body cold and my clothes covered in dust. The paintings were all in place, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked again at the painting of the woman, I realized that she was no longer smiling. Since that day, I have never entered that mansion again. But even far from it, something continues to haunt me. Reflections seem to watch me back, and sometimes, at night, I hear soft footsteps in the hallways of my house, and every time I pass by a mirror or a window, I see the reflection smiling, as if it were waiting for the right moment to replace me. I've always been intrigued by urban stories, especially haunted houses. So when I moved to San Francisco and heard about an old Victorian house where the lights never went out, I knew I had to see it for myself. They said no one had lived there for decades, but every night at exactly midnight, the lights would turn on by themselves. It was just a legend, I thought. But something about the story made me uneasy. The first night, I parked my car across the street, prepared to wait until midnight to see for myself. The house was huge, with tall windows and an ivy-covered facade. The curtains were closed, but for some reason, the house seemed to be watching me. At 11:59 p.m., everything was dark and quiet, but as soon as the clock struck midnight, all at once the lights in the windows came on. My heart raced. I kept waiting for someone to appear, for a shadow to pass by the window, or for a door to open, but nothing happened. The lights stayed on for a few minutes, and then went out again, as if they had never been turned on. The next day, I asked a neighbor about the house. He gave me a strange look before answering. "No one has lived there for over 50 years. But I saw the lights come on last night," I insisted. He shook his head, his expression tense. "It's best not to get involved. Anyone who tries to find out what's going on there ends up disappearing." That night, I went back. I couldn't resist. Something about the house was calling me. At 11:55 p.m., I parked again, this time closer. The street was deserted and silent, and the cold breeze carried the smell of dust and old wood. At midnight, the lights came back on, but this time, one of the windows on the second floor was open, and I could clearly see a motionless figure standing in the window, watching me. My heart sank. For an instant, the figure disappeared, but before I could react, the front door slowly opened, as if inviting me in. That was when I heard a whisper coming from inside the house. "Come, we're waiting." The open door seemed to beckon me, as if the house itself were waiting for me. My mind told me to leave, but my legs moved on their own. I crossed the street, my heart racing, the silence around me almost suffocating. When I reached the door, a cold breeze enveloped me. The air was heavy, with the strong smell of old wood and something rotten, as if the house had not been opened for a long time. I entered slowly, trying to control my breathing. The entrance hall was lit by a large antique chandelier. The lights flickered softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the floor creaked beneath my feet. "Is someone here?" My voice echoed through the house, but no answer came. Then I heard the sound. Footsteps upstairs. They were light but clear, as if someone was walking calmly from one room to another. I glanced up the stairs and saw a shadow cast on the wall at the top, the silhouette of a person standing still. "Who's there?" I asked again, my voice shaking. The shadow moved slowly, disappearing down the hallway. Against all my instincts, I started up the stairs. Each step seemed louder than the last, and the sound of my footsteps mixed with the echoes of the ones I had heard before. At the top of the stairs, the hallway was lit by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The doors were all open, revealing empty, dark rooms. But at the end of the hallway, the last door was ajar, with a dim light flickering inside. I approached slowly, my heart beating so loudly it seemed to echo in the silence. When I pushed open the door, the room was empty, except for a rocking chair in the center, rocking gently. It was then that I realized the walls were covered in mirrors. I looked at the closest one and my reflection was there, but it wasn't me. In the mirror, my own version was smiling, a wide, unnatural smile that grew wider and wider as his eyes darkened until they were completely black. The reflection raised his hand, waving slowly, and then, without moving his mouth, whispered directly into my mind, "You belong to us now." The glass in the mirror began to crack, a web of fissures spreading rapidly. I tried to look away, but my feet were stuck to the floor. That's when I heard the sound behind me, the door closing by itself. The room plunged into darkness. The last sound I heard before everything went silent was the soft laughter coming from all the mirrors at once. When I woke up, I was lying on the sidewalk in front of the house. The sky was beginning to lighten, and the lights in the house were off. I got up slowly, my body aching, my head spinning. I looked at the house one more time. In the second-floor window, the same silhouette was there, watching me, but now, with the same smile as my reflection in the mirror. Since that night, something has changed in me. Sometimes, when I pass by a mirror, I see that same smile for a brief second, even when I'm not smiling, and I always hear the whisper, soft and constant, "Come back, the house is still waiting." The house was old, but it had character. I bought the property in Baltimore, thinking it would be a good renovation project, a chance to start over. It was a Victorian, with tall windows and a huge attic. The realtor warned me that no one had lived there for over 40 years, but I thought it was just a curiosity of no importance. The first week, everything was quiet. I spent my days painting the walls and tidying up the rooms. The attic, however, always made me uncomfortable. The door to it was locked, and the key seemed to have disappeared long ago. Every night before I went to sleep, I would feel a strange presence coming from above, as if the attic were alive. The air in that part of the house was always colder, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would hear soft footsteps on the ceiling, as if someone were walking up there. On the third night, I woke up at 3 in the morning to an even more disturbing sound, a voice whispering my name. "Lucas." My spine shivered. I lay there, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the whisper kept coming. "Lucas, come here." I slowly got up, my hands sweating, and went into the hallway. The sound was coming straight from the attic, behind the locked door. I put my ear to the wood and heard a low, almost childish laugh, followed by 3 sharp knocks on the door. I took a step back, trying to understand what was happening. It was then that the door creaked softly, opening by itself a few inches. "Come up, we're waiting." The darkness of the attic seemed to beckon me, as if it had its own weight. I grabbed the flashlight on my cell phone and slowly climbed the first few steps. The air grew colder with each step. The smell of dust and old wood was suffocating. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw the attic for the first time. It was bigger than I had imagined, with furniture covered in sheets, old boxes, and a rocking chair in the center. The chair was facing the window, rocking slightly, as if someone had just stepped out of it. My entire body felt goosebumps. Suddenly, the sound came back. "Lucas, we're here." I looked around, shining the flashlight into every corner. It was then that I saw something that made me catch my breath. Footprints on the dusty floor. They started from the rocking chair and went toward the back wall. The wall was cracked, as if something was hiding behind it. Before I could move, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. Then, I heard the voice again, right behind me. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was so close it felt like it was whispering directly into my ear. "You shouldn't be here." My body froze, and the air around me grew so cold that my breath came out in steam. The flashlight flickered again, illuminating the attic for a second. It was enough for me to see something that made me freeze. The rocking chair was no longer empty. A figure sat in it, a pale child with dark eyes and a wide, crooked smile. She rocked slowly, watching me silently. "Do you want to play?" she asked, her voice thin and slurred. I took a step back, trying to stay calm, but the floor creaked beneath my feet, and the sound was like a trigger. The figure rose from the chair in a sudden movement, so fast it seemed to float, and stopped a few feet away from me. "Why are you running away?" she whispered, her head tilting to the side. The boxes around me began to move on their own, falling off the shelves, while the rocking chair spun around without anyone touching it. The sound of footsteps echoed throughout the attic, coming from several directions at once. I ran. I almost stumbled down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the hallway, the attic door slammed behind me, shaking the entire house. Silence returned, but my instincts told me that I was still not safe. I ran to the living room, trying to grab my cell phone, but the screen was frozen with a single message written in red letters. "We are with you." It was then that I heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they were coming from the hallway, directly towards me. Before I could react, the lights in the house went out, and the only thing that remained was the sound of children's laughter, getting closer and closer. The next morning, I woke up in the entrance of the house, my body cold and my mind confused. The attic was locked again, as if it had never been opened. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream, but the footprints were still there, and the echo of the voice remained in my mind. Since then, the nights have never been peaceful. Sometimes I hear footsteps on the ceiling, or a low laugh coming from the attic, always around 3 in the morning. And sometimes I see the shadow of someone standing at the top of the stairs, waiting for me to go up again. But I never go up, never again. The house was simple, but perfect for me. An old building in Portland, Maine, with rustic charm and an incredible view of the woods. I bought the house without thinking twice, eager to start a new phase in my life. The realtor mentioned that the basement had never been used, but honestly, that didn't bother me. The first week, things were peaceful. I spent my days arranging furniture and getting used to the silence of the area. The basement remained locked at all times, and despite my curiosity, I left the door closed. Something about the place made me uncomfortable. Then, one cold night, around 2 in the morning, I heard it for the first time. A soft, distant cry. I got out of bed, thinking it was the wind blowing through the windows, but the sound was too clear to be that. It was a child's cry, coming from the back of the house, right where the basement door was. I stood in the hallway, listening carefully. The sound was faint, but continuous, as if someone was crying silently, waiting to be heard. My heart raced, and my mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal trapped down there. With shaking hands, I turned on the hallway light and walked to the basement door. The crying grew louder as I approached, each step increasing the pressure in my chest. When I placed my hand on the cold doorknob, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence was even more frightening. I slowly turned the key and opened the door. A smell of damp and old wood filled the air, making me recoil for a second. I shined the flashlight on my cell phone on the stairs and slowly descended. Each step creaked, and the feeling of being watched accompanied me with each step. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight illuminated the space. The basement was empty. There were only a few old boxes and a wooden chair leaning against the wall. "Is anyone here?" I asked, my voice echoing through the empty space. No answer. I was about to head back upstairs when I heard it again, the crying behind me. I turned quickly, shining my light on the brick wall. It was then that I noticed something strange. There were small handprints in the dust on the floor, starting in the corner and going straight to the chair. Before I could react, the basement door slammed shut, and the crying turned into a low, disturbing laugh. The basement door slammed so hard that the sound echoed through the space, leaving me paralyzed for a few seconds. The laughter continued, low and distant, but now it seemed to be everywhere at once, enveloping every corner of the basement. I ran to the door, trying to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was locked, stuck as if someone outside had decided to keep me there. The air grew colder, and the feeling that I wasn't alone grew stronger by the second. The flashlight on my cell phone flickered, casting unstable shadows on the brick walls. I looked at the corner where the chair had been. It was gone. My heart raced. A scuff mark in the dust showed that the chair had been moved, but to where? "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. The crying came again, this time louder and more desperate, as if someone was right next to me. When I turned the flashlight toward the sound, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small, pale figure huddled in the dark corner of the basement, rocking back and forth. "Please, help me," it whispered, its voice weak and broken. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure slowly raised its head, revealing a deformed, eyeless face, its mouth distorted into a wide, frightening smile. "You shouldn't have come down here," it said, its voice now deep and filled with something that sounded like hatred and satisfaction at the same time. The crying mixed with laughter, and the figure began moving toward me, not walking, but gliding across the floor, its feet never touching the ground. I ran to the door again, kicking it hard, trying to break it down. The sound of my knocking mixed with the laughter and whispers coming from all sides. Finally, the door burst open, almost knocking me to the floor. I ran up the stairs, tripping on the steps, and when I reached the hallway, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it again. Silence returned, but the air still felt heavy, as if something was on the other side, waiting. The next morning, the door was ajar again. The handprints were still there, but now they seemed more numerous, scattered all over the walls of the basement. Since that day, I have never gone down there again. Sometimes, at night, I still hear the distant crying, mixed with laughter, always at the same time, always at 2 in the morning. And sometimes, the wooden chair appears in different places in the house, as if it were waiting for me. But I never approach it, because I know that if I look too closely, I will see that figure smiling at me again, and next time, she won't let me leave.